Good morning. My name is Anthony Noble, and I'm a 1999 graduate of Syracuse University and the chair of Syracuse University's DC Regional Council. It's an honor and pleasure to introduce a Syracuse alumnus who leads by example, Syracuse University trustee Paul Greenberg. Paul has been the driving force behind the success of Syracuse University in Washington, recognizing the need for the university to have a more visible profile in Washington. Paul donated the naming gift to the Paul Greenberg House, which is located in Woodley Park. The Greenberg House, as many of you know, opened in 1990. This year will be the 25th anniversary of the Greenberg House, and of course we are having a 25th anniversary celebration. The Greenberg House and Paul Greenberg's efforts in Washington have really inspired me and inspired others to participate and to give back to Syracuse. And I think that Paul, through the speaker series, certainly continues to show how much he cares about the university and how much the university means in the lives of its alumni and in public life in general. At this time, I would like to acknowledge one of our special guests, the Honorable Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee. The Congresswoman's distinguished career illustrates her commitment to upholding the constitutional rights of all people, and we are especially grateful that she is with us today to participate in this important discussion. And at this time, I'd like to welcome Paul Greenberg to the stage. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. If you listened to the weather report this morning, you probably would have stayed in bed. So I think I really take my hats off to everyone that's here. You know, I always said it's quality, not quantity. And so I'm glad you're here. And so with that being said, I'd like to welcome everybody to the Syracuse University Greenberg Speaker Series. And I'm very pleased that you are able to join us for this wonderful, important discussion. As a trustee of Syracuse University, I established the Greenberg Speaker Series to highlight important programs and initiatives that are at the core of the university's mission. I'm particularly pleased that these conversations are occurring now in my hometown of Washington, D.C., where Syracuse University has a powerful presence of nearly 15,000 alumni. And that is very special. And I assure you, if the weather was just a little better, you'd have a lot more of them here today. Our goal is that today's timely conversation will educate us on the history and future of the Emmett Till Civil Rights Crimes Act, and give us an insight into the outstanding work being done by the Cold Case Justice Initiative at Syracuse University College of Law. I hope that the conversation that we hear here today continues long after this session concludes. At this time, I'd like to acknowledge my fellow trustee, Theodore McKee. Ted. who's traveled here from Philadelphia, not this morning, I may say, to be with us today. Ted is the Chief Judge of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit. We are grateful for his contributions to Syracuse University. Also at this time, I'm pleased to introduce Janice McDonald, College of Law professor and co-director of the Cold Case Justice Initiative. Janice will provide a brief summary about CCJI and introduce the moderator and panelists. Thank you very much for coming today. Janice.
I want to first, I have to go down. I want to first thank Paul Greenberg for making this possible so that we could have this important discussion and bring family members here to the Washington, D.C. area. And after the panel is over, they will be traveling up to the Hill and meeting with other congressmen and women this afternoon. The Cold Case Justice Initiative has always put the families first. And so I want to introduce the family representatives that have traveled to come here today. That is our priority. Those are the people that we have advocated for the last 7 years. We are only new to this. They have been fighting this fight and struggling for justice for 60 and 50 and 40 years every day. And so I want to welcome first the members representing families. We have with the Emmett Till family on the panel Erica Gordon-Taylor, who is of the generation now that is starting to take over the battle to bring this together for other families. And seated in the front table is her mother, Ollie Gordon, who worked with Mamie Till Mobley, the mother of Emmett Till, and has struggled for many, many years in order to accomplish the Emmett Till Act and to help other families as well as their own. And Thelma Edwards, who is now living in Florida. She is the daughter of Mose Wright. It was at Mose Wright's home that Emmett Till was taken by the two white men who don't even really deserve names in this discussion. But it was her brother who was in the bed with Emmett Till when they came and dragged him out, tortured, murdered him. And so we welcome the Emmett Till family here today to speak to us and to keep moving this forward. Also with us today is the representatives of the Frank Morris family. Frank Morris was murdered in 1964. Tomorrow is the 50th anniversary of the brutal attack on him and his shoe repair shop in Faraday, Louisiana. 3 white men, Klan representatives, broke into his shop and poured gasoline on the shop, and then he was living in the back of the shop with his 10-year-old grandson, and his 12-year-old granddaughter was living in another house. But so he got his grandson out and confronted the men. They pointed a gun at him. They poured gasoline on him. They lit the fire. He was able to escape the fire, covered in flames, and he died 4 days later of third-degree burns over his entire body. We have today with us his great-granddaughter, Darlene Morris Newville, who is also on the panel, and also his great-great-granddaughter, Nalita Gaines, who has joined us from Louisiana. So we welcome them. And we also have here representatives of families who are trying to be covered by the Emmett Till Act. Janice Cameron from Atlanta, Georgia, and her son Mackenzie. They represent the 5 families of fishermen who disappeared in 1974 from Pensacola, Florida, where they had always gone to go fishing. They disappeared, and their bodies were later washed up. Members of civil rights community from Atlanta went to Pensacola to investigate, and they too have not received the justice that they deserve for the brutal murders of their 5 family members. And Janice's father, Mr. Holloway, was one of the 5 fishermen. So we welcome them. I don't know if there are any other representatives of other families here. Okay, good. So we welcome the family members to this. And then we have other panel members that I wanted to introduce. Paul Delaney is a renowned journalist who covered the civil rights period during the time of the 60s civil rights movement. He has been a journalist at a number of prestigious institutions. And in talking with him, I know that he was one of those people in Atlanta during the early civil rights movement in Atlanta and participated in what for us as the Cold Case Justice Initiative has been a really important source of information for finding victims who have not been named. The Atlanta Daily World, the Atlanta Inquirer, the Atlanta Voice, all African-American newspapers in that area documented what the mainstream newspapers did not document at the time. And so our students have gone through all those newspapers and identified suspicious cases that were not put on the FBI list of unsolved civil rights cases. We've identified over 300 names that are not on the FBI list but should be looked at by the FBI. So welcome, Paul Delaney, also. And then, of course, you all have heard Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee is here and joining us with this. The Emmett Till Act that was passed in 2008 was a bipartisan effort, and the Congressional Black Caucus really were leaders among those who pushed to get the Emmett Till Act finally passed. It had several different efforts over the years to get passed, but her work in supporting that and in trying to make it mean something and to consider what needs to be done now that it ends in 2017, we welcome her participation on the panel also. Let me just tell you, just spend a minute to tell you about the Cold Case Justice Initiative. Eric Holder actually sends his regrets. We invited him. He did not delegate someone from the Justice Department in his place, but he did send his regrets. And we have met with him as my co-director, Paula Johnson, who's also on the panel. We've met with members of the Justice Department over the last 7 years to try and advocate on behalf of the families. Paula Johnson, who has been my colleague and an incredible supporter of all of the families, will join the panel to help facilitate the discussion. So we welcome Paula Johnson also. We started our efforts at Syracuse University in 2007, that's why I say we're newcomers to this, at the request of the Frank Morris family. Rosa Morris Williams, the granddaughter of Frank Morris, could not be here today, but she has been steadfast in her pushing for justice for all of that time. And she contacted us and asked for our help. She'd been talking to a newspaper reporter in Faraday, Louisiana, who has now done 250 stories in the last 7 years with our help and material that we have located to focus on the investigation of the Frank Morris murder, as well as many others. We decided right away it was the right thing to do, and so we thought we were just helping one family to start with, a huge task. And when we first went back to Louisiana, we found that there were more families who wanted to meet with us, whose names had not been recorded, who wanted our help. And so in this small community of Faraday, Louisiana, Concordia Parish, Louisiana, and across the river in Natchez, we ended up with about 15 cases in just that small area of homicides that had occurred and had not been fully prosecuted or investigated. So we we started with them. The Emmett Till Act then was passed. The Emmett Till Act asked for urgent, thorough investigation of these cases. And so we expected that that's what would happen. We've worked with the Justice Department on that. We have given them documents that our law students found. We started in that summer. Students just joined us and helped with the finding documents. We found 6,000 unredacted FBI files in the National Archives Annex in College Park, Maryland. Our students have digested those, indexed them, and found documents in cities all over the United States to support saying there should be investigations. The other thing that we found is that no one has ever done a full accounting of all the people who disappeared or were killed during that era of the pre-1969 and the post-1969 homicides. And so we have undertaken to identify as many of those as we possibly can and to push Congress to really ask for the kind of regional task force or presidential commission that would do a thorough job in identifying all of them and not just the list that the FBI had to begin with in this search. We hope that there's a good discussion about this. Our task has grown, and I just have to thank Syracuse University for the support that's given us over these years to be able to work on this now full-time by Professor Paula Johnson and I, as well as the many students, over 150. And I know that we even have some of our students who were in our very first class 7 years ago. And over the years, we have some of our students who are working in the cold case now. So you'll find out more about what we've been doing as the discussion goes on. So I want to also introduce a very special guest and the facilitator, moderator of our panel, Frederica Whitfield. Many of you probably know of her as the CNN anchor on the weekends, who does all of the news on the weekend and has covered so many stories. Some of you may know her because her father is a famous Olympian and is also a member of the Tuskegee Airmen. Mel Whitfield was prominent in both of those endeavors, as well as I'm sure many others. Some of you know her as, someone who didn't go to Newhouse to study journalism, but went to Howard and received her degree at Howard in journalism. Some of you may know her because you lived in the many cities where she has been on television as a correspondent. I was in New Haven when she was on the television there in New Haven. She's been in South Carolina and Charlotte, South Carolina. She's been in Dallas. She joined first NBC in Atlanta, and now it's been since 2002 that she's been with CNN. Some of you may know her because of her outstanding reporting of Hurricane Katrina. She received awards for that. She's received awards from Ebony magazine and an Emmy for her work. And some of you may know her as the mother of the 3 wonderful children and her photographer husband, who's been a supporter of the Cold Case Justice Initiative. He's around here somewhere, never stops taking photos. But we also know her as a fearless, warm, and thoughtful commentator on what's going on in society today. So I welcome Frederica Whitfield.
Thank you, Janice. That's the best intro I've ever heard of myself. I've just gotten to know myself. Thank you. Oh, what an incredible honor it is to be here. And there's my husband. You were mentioned, John. Hello. Yeah, usually behind the camera, now in the spotlight. Thank you so much. It is an incredible honor to be here and to be part of a very important discussion, an understanding of history from the point of view of the family members whose loved ones are at the centerpiece of too many unsolved civil rights criminal cases, and from the point of view of great legal minds and legislative minds who are bringing us to today. The Emmett Till Unsolved Civil Rights Crime Act, designed to help secure funding to resolve these many cases, help close wounds even, perhaps. So what is the progress report? To help measure that, may I invite Erica Gordon Taylor as the first one to speak, to really help convey what your family has gone through over the years, what the experience has been like for you to be a family member of a family that has been the centerpiece of an indelible measure of what this nation has gone through during the civil rights movement and beyond.
For our family, we've never received judicial justice. And we work endlessly to gain justice in many different facets. So the Emmett Till Act for us is a form of justice. Although the verdict remained not guilty for J.W. Milam and Roy Bryant, for us, we strive daily, monthly, yearly to do other work that helps us feel as though we are always getting our justice through education, constantly educating the world and our children about the legacy of Emmett Till and what happened, and through the work of Syracuse and the Civil Rights Act and what they're doing with investigating the cold cases. They're educating the students in as much as helping families try to resolve the cases. So that's a form of justice for us. The foundation, the Mamie Till Mobley Memorial Foundation that my mother, Ollie Gordon, and myself founded, it's another avenue for us to get justice. It's very painful. Although the FBI and the Department of Justice, they reopened the case, it also reopened the wounds. The wounds, they settle. They never go away, but they settle. And I think if I can send this question over to Thelma some, who lived through that time, maybe she can help to explain how it felt to go through that time frame and live through that, as well as how it felt for her to receive, again, a not guilty verdict once they reopened the case and they presented what the findings were when the FBI called our family in and explained it. Although she wasn't there, she received the same information from the family. Mm-hmm. It was not guilty. There was nothing else that could be done. So if we can ask her.
And Thelma, Thelma's in the red here, in the beautiful red, here in the front table. And Thelma, you were in Chicago with Mamie Till when that phone call came that her 14-year-old son had been viciously murdered. And you can help convey to us the incredible courage that Mamie Till would exhibit. She would rise to that occasion and very courageously say to the world, to the nation, that you are going to look at what happened to my son. There will be an open casket. So describe for us, if you could, if you can recall, what age were you, first of all, when that phone call came to Mamie Till? Thanks, Judge.
Actually, I was
You have a job in television next. So go ahead. How old were you when that phone call came, and did you understand what was happening at the time?
Well, I was grown. I was sent to Emmett Till's grandmother, my mother's youngest sister, at the tender age of 8 years old in 1939, in order to go to school to get a good education. So I lived with them for 39 to 49, and Emmett was born in 1941. So he was more like a brother. I pinned diapers on him, those old bird's eye diapers, and every time he stood up, the diaper would fall. But when I heard the news, I was back in the little town where I grew up, little blue-collar town, 10 miles from Chicago's Loop. And I would see Emmett every Wednesday because we went back and forth to the little town where we grew up. He was in Chicago by that time. And when I heard the news, I was actually in church. And they told us that 2 white men came and took Emmett. His nickname was Bobo, and we always called him Bo. And the church stopped everything, and they prayed, and I cried, and I cried, and I cried. And someone went to a church, and the lady said, Emmett is dead, but he will be found Wednesday. And for some reason, I couldn't eat. I would take 1 swallow and just fill up. I didn't eat until after the funeral. And Emmett was a sacrifice. I'll never really get over it. And I'm so appreciative of this coalition that's working to help others. I lost 10 pounds in 1 week because of his death. So when I heard the news, I was actually 24. I know that he didn't die in vain. Rosa Parks said that she was thinking of Emmett when she didn't get up on the bus, but at the very beginning, she said that her feet were hurting her. And I used to tell people that. But at her funeral, Jesse Jackson said she was thinking of Emmett, and she didn't get up. Thank God for this group of people who are working. When I heard that nobody was charged when they opened the case in the second time, my heart was broken. Yes, the 2 men were dead, but his wife was alive, moved from Mississippi to North Carolina. She had diabetes, and she wasn't in good health. Every question that they asked her, she said, I don't remember. So that's a wound that it won't be healed, but I'm still alive and I'm hopeful.
So, Miss Thelma, I wonder if there's a way in which to explain your resilience and your strength. It was your father, Mose Wright, whose home Emmett Till was taken. And so you experienced this while you were in Chicago. You also experienced it from, the Southerner's point of view as well, given your father was still there. So what is the explanation behind your resilience all these years? Even though you say you will never get over it, you speak of it with such poignance.
As with my father was very spiritual, and he had seen this happening 20 years before. He didn't know what it was. He said it was a very wide, muddy river. The closer he got to it, the smaller it became until he finally stepped over it. I credit my faith in God. And my father was a good example. One night he couldn't rest. So he got up and got into his car and went down to the church and slept. And about 2 o'clock in the morning, someone passed through and saw 2 white men with flashlights going through my father's house. They passed themselves off as reporters, but he knew that they came to kill him. The incident, it shook up the whole Emmett Till murder. The case shook up everybody. Some of the whites told Dad, said, there's nothing that a 14-year-old could do to me to make me kill him. If you had just told me there was any trouble, I would have gotten the boy away. I haven't been able to sleep since it happened. So again, I just hark back to the fact that God has given me the strength to forgive. I really don't. I'm hurt. I'll always be hurt. But I don't have any animosity in my heart or hatred toward the men who did this.
Ms. Thelma Wright. Thank you.
And if I could just,
Sure.
if I could just add on to what she said there, Mamie Till Mobley died without any hate in her heart towards the men that murdered her son.
Darlene Nichelle Morris Newbill, the great-granddaughter of Frank Morris, who in 1964 in Fairleigh, Louisiana, as this shoe repairman shop owner was doused with the gasoline, who later died after being burned. You grew up not knowing about this history, and only in recent years did it come to light. Explain your feelings, that mix of emotions from shock to anger, shame, and then pride upon learning what happened and what your expectations have been by way of this act.
Well, when my mom was telling me, I was like, why we haven't heard about this earlier, you know? I walk by the place every day, you know, didn't even know, had a house, didn't even know or nothing. And she was like, well, baby, we didn't know what was gonna happen, you know, because after my grandfather died, his daughter, his only daughter, she left. She left my mom behind. So after that, my mom said she couldn't take it no more, so she left, and she left us behind, me and my sister behind. And so me and my sister, we was adopted, and life went on, and the people who adopted us, I guess they wanted us to be safe too. So they didn't tell. So when I heard,
So there's almost a feeling that they thought they were protecting you by never sharing this.
So after I heard about it, really, Paula and Miss Janice, thank them. I was hurt because I was like, how he died, I just couldn't believe how someone would hurt somebody like that, a human being like that, because of what they heard, what he was doing, because he was friendly, because everyone got along with him. That's what I see, how it was. Then, you know, my mom, she kept talking to me. I was angry. I really was angry. And then I started praying about it. She said, baby, you have to pray. So we prayed about it and everything. But now, I'm not mad. You know, it's history. And my grandfather's a hero to me because he didn't leave. You know, he wasn't scared. He didn't back down. So he's a hero to me.
He is indeed. Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, how are you? Good to see you. You were among many who fought very hard to make sure this measure was passed. And the expectations that so many cases that have been unsolved for so long would finally find closure. There have been no indictments. How do you measure the progress of this act?
Thank you very much. Good morning, Frederica. I'll add my own applause and appreciation for your astute journalism and the many times that I've caught you on CNN and the probative questioning that you have done. And I sometimes pity those who are being interviewed and sometimes celebrate. But you're getting the truth, and we thank you. Let's give her a very big hand.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good morning. What a privilege to be able to sit with such heroic persons. This is what America is all about. I was reading the pamphlet from the Pensacola Five, and I'd like that to be just a brief theme in answering your question. And that is, it says words that'll be very potent to me, that we are still here. And I think that is what this audience represents. Janice, let me thank you. I have very large memories of you in my office and you being persistent and educating and having the sense of heart and spirit. I think you are all in, as they say, and I congratulate you, and I'm ready to jump back all in again because we can do this and we can get convictions, and that is my commitment today. Let me thank Paul Greenberg. I'm not sure where he is sitting, but anybody that invests in this effort is clearly the defining moment for what America is and what our Constitution is. As a senior member on the Judiciary Committee, Paul, let me thank you for saying that we always brag about our Constitution, that it is a living document. And the only way that it's a living document is if that Americans pour into its life, that they realize that that premise of making a more perfect union, that Declaration of the Independence, which is not in the Constitution, but the whole series of the Bill of Rights has to be alive. Due process has to be alive. Thank you for this center. Thank you for your work. We appreciate you greatly. So where are we? If I might give a little historical perspective and just remind everybody that the 2007 law, the Emmett Till law, did designate a deputy for this cold case, a series of cold cases. Now, Janice, you're telling me that you have, through your excellent students, and I want to give the students a hand as well, they have been dynamic. Judge, leaders here in the community, forgive me for not calling the roll of everyone, but the Deputy Attorney General was a position, or is a position of power. The designation of a special agent, all of this was galvanized in order to focus people on, or focus an element in the Department of Justice to work on these cases. So what more is needed for convictions? And that is persistent body politic that is in this room. One of the things that I think is missing in terms of emphasis was the state and local grants to push the state and local communities. And I think as we look at the amending and reformation and adding to the legislation, including a presidential commission, we have to ask ourselves, did the information get to the state and local governments? They should be engaged in taking the lead in some of these issues. And forgive me for weaving the timeliness to the families. You need to know that you're sort of in the mix now, even so some of these cases may have been civilian-based, but you're in the mix now for Trayvon Martin. You're in the mix now, different issues, but they all point to the question of the justice and the dignity of human life. And this is what you're saying as families. Does Emmett Till, does the expanded families, does my grandfather, my great-grandfather deserve the kind of dignity? And who are we as Americans if we cannot take the Constitution and make it a living document? I'm reminded of the Civil Rights Memorial, if I might just cite that it has 40 people. This is something that the Southern Poverty Law Center did. But they admit that there are more. And of course, Emmett Till's names are on there, but some are not. The list is approximately 75 people who died violently between 1952 and 1968 under circumstances suggesting that they were victims of racial violence. Its research has covered more, and of course, some of those names are not on that, and so there are many more. I would want to say that the cases that we have today will be a historical framework for a decade going forward, or 2 decades going forward. The Eric Garner case, Sean Bell, as I said, Trayvon Martin, and of course, the case of Michael Brown, Abdou Diablo, different reactions, different responses, but it is the question of whether life is still intact. And so one of the issues that I think that we can talk of, and if I might just deviate for a moment, I wanted to mention the 1968 Orangeburg massacre at South Carolina State, where state police shot and killed 3 student protesters. The 1967 shooting death of Carrie Brumfield, whose body was found in a rural Louisiana road. The 1957 murder of Willie Joe Sanford, whose body was fished out of a creek in Hawkinsville, Georgia. The 1946 killing of a black couple, including a pregnant woman who was pulled out of a car in Monroe, Georgia, and dragged down a wagon trail before being shot in front of 200 people. Make no mistake, these acts are acts that define America to some and many around the world. It is important that this meeting is here today where we are making a stand that this will not happen. So my response would be is that the squeaky wheel gets the attention. We have a framework of legislation. We now must renew its initiative even before its reauthorization in 2017. we may look to include several elements that may be helpful to these families. One
So it
that,
expires in 4 years, but you're saying you're hoping there's a commitment to try to extend it.
try to extend it,
Because we're talking about 107 cases.
but more importantly, the bill can be amended as we speak. You can go in and amend the bill. You can make the directive to the state and local authorities with bipartisan support more of a requirement, more of a directive. If there is a cold case in your jurisdiction, that's one of the elements that you can look at. And then I would say, in this day and time, cases of murder are to be investigated by local police authorities. You can hold those police authorities to a standard of saying, you have a cold case. This is one of them. You're receiving federal funds. We would like you to put this back on your agenda to look at this cold case. So there are many ways of doing it. And I think lastly, what I would say is that the question of the history of our community, being freed slaves by President Lincoln and coming from Texas, we got it 2 years later, so we have something called Juneteenth. But it is not that far back to say to America that it is not the race question, or we're not always talking about race, to be able to ask for America to rise to our higher angels, and for us to do it in a collaborative way where we don't see race in the collaboration of those who come and work with us, that in fact they are Americans. And if they are Americans, they want their nation to be known as a just nation. And this bill is one of the attempts that we made to be able to say to Emmett Till's family and all the other families that you are not forgotten, that justice is overdue, and as Martin says, that it must roll down like mighty waters. And I would argue that this is an appropriate time for us to use the Emmett Till Act, not only for cold cases, but maybe to begin to look for the recent legacy of cold cases, now in a different element, to be able to honor these families for their perseverance and join in the other families that are hurting and who have not been able to find justice. This may be the moment where we do this in a way that breathes life into the law and breathes life into the Constitution. So there are many elements. I look forward to the meetings that we're going to have. I think this is a cause. I feel this is a cause. I'm moved by the cause that this is going to rise us to the mountaintop that Martin King spoke of and the promised land that he asked us to get to. Even though he would not get there with us, he knew that this nation would get to the promised land someday.
Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, thank you. And we know that you will continue to drive the conversation, move the conversation, and we also realize that you're busy, and we appreciate you being here. And so the Congresswoman may have to leave, not because she's not completely invested and interested in this topic, but we know because you have to continue with the business of the American people, for the American people, and for that we really appreciate it.
Thank you so very much. Thank you.
Paula,
a little bit longer. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Paula Johnson, the Department of Justice, will say that a long amount of time has elapsed. And for that, sometimes witnesses die, sometimes the accounts are cloudy, memory stands in the way of having a clear view of what happened. And that, in large part, is what's standing in the way of closing many of these cases. What do you say to the Department of Justice? And we understand the invitation was there. Eric Holder, nor representative, was able to be here, but we do appreciate the acknowledgement for the invitation that you've extended. But what is the response when you're told that there are so many obstacles as to why these cases remain unsolved?
Well, certainly there are difficulties and challenges with any quote-unquote cold case. And I would begin by saying, in a large degree, it's a misnomer to talk about cold cases, because to the degree that the cases remain unsolved, these are very present cases. You've heard from the Emmett Till family, you've heard from the family of Frank Morris. These cases remain unsolved, and so these wounds are very much present, and the continuing injustice for families like the Camerons and the other fishermen who left one morning to go from Atlanta to Pensacola and never returned, these unsolved cases are with us today. And so to some degree, we certainly understand that there are challenges in cases that are older. But we are not convinced that the Department of Justice has done all that it can or should do in the thoroughness of the pursuit of finding information, of locating witness, of combing through documents. I mean, as Professor McDonald mentioned earlier in the introduction, many of our students have combed through information. We have looked at the newspapers, particularly those from the African American community who reported these incidents, to try to find cases that looked as though they were suspicious, where just looking through those articles, it raised our concern that something more was not told in this story, something more was not done. There weren't investigations. Where there were investigations, there weren't indictments. So there's plenty more to be done. And even though we're talking about, in some cases, several decades, we know that there are still perpetrators who are alive, who can be pursued. And we are encouraging and urging the Department of Justice to do more along those lines.
So what's standing in the way? Is there a lack of interest, a lack of commitment?
I would not go so far as to say there's a lack of interest, nor lack of commitment, but how that interest and how that commitment is expressed becomes the question for getting an effective resolution to what needs to be done in these cases. We have suggested, for instance, in our meetings with Attorney General Holder and with members of the Civil Rights Division, that they need to do more with the local prosecutors, law enforcement. As Congresswoman Jackson Lee has mentioned, the statute itself calls for that kind of collaboration, and they have yet to do that in a meaningful way. Some of you may be familiar, for instance, with drug cases, and there will be collaborations between the federal, DEA and the local law enforcement. We called for a replication of that kind of effort, that the federal government, FBI, Department of Justice should be working hand in hand with local law enforcement to do these cases. And we have not seen that being done in a demonstrative way. And so we still call on the Department of Justice to work very closely with the local officials.
All right. Paul Delaney, as a former editor and correspondent for the New York Times, clearly covering these atrocities was very difficult. How were you hoping this act, this Emmett Till Act, might change, alter, or rewrite some of the stories, the history?
Well, echoing Paula, I mentioned to her last night, in fact, that I'm surprised and disappointed that the Justice Department has not seen fit to move more vigorously on these cases. In covering the federal government for a few decades, I know there is a kind of a complacency in this huge bureaucracy. But I think there are...
And what do you mean by that exactly?
Well, a lot of agencies, a lot of agency heads, they don't want to do too much. They don't want to rattle too many skeletons. They don't want to upset too many people. And I can understand they have priorities. And I think this issue for them is not top priority. And when you, in a huge bureaucracy like the Justice Department, they pursue whatever is won, will shine a good light on them, and will ignore the quiet things that will not, it'll be significant work, but will not be a page one article. So this is nothing new. It's been going on for decades. But I think with this kind of effort, this audience, the Syracuse project should maybe light a fire under the Justice Department. That's what's got to be done.
And to the Cameron family, we're talking about the 40th anniversary of your loved ones among the 5 Atlanta fishermen who set off to Pensacola and never returned. That case is not part of, or not protected by this Emmett Till Act. Cases before 1969 are included in the Emmett Till Act. Is it your hope that if this act is extended past the deadline in 4 years, that your family's case would be involved in it? And what's your response when you hear Mr. Delaney, paraphrase that there may be a feeling of those who are involved in investigating these cases that it's not top priority? It's not his point of view, but he's conveying that point of view by way of the stories that he's reported and the feeling that he's received.
I feel that that's sad. That's very sad. I got involved in this because I want my father and his friend's story told. I feel like we are repeating it today in the Eric Garner, the Michael Brown, and these cases, Trayvon Martin. These cases need to be told. People need to know we are repeating our history every day. We've got to stir this up. It has to be told. I have my son here with me today, and I want my kids to know what happened so it will not continue to happen in this country.
So Congresswoman, particularly when hearing the passion, hearing that these wounds are deep, and we heard from Ms. Thelma who said the wounds don't necessarily heal. It really is forever. And so how is it that those who may be reticent to the passion or may not understand if there's a cultural difference or if the divide is so great because of so many decades have elapsed, how do you help convey, as a Congresswoman, how does America help convey the importance of these cases so as not to be repeated?
Well,
These
first of all,
cases
the
are not to be
question,
repeated.
I think it goes to the theme that Ms. Johnson was using and the one that I've used about a living, breathing Constitution and a living, breathing law. It is to address the pain of today because the pain is not gone. I sit on the Homeland Security Committee and was there from the moment of ground zero in terms of a congressional response. And of course, there were the 9/11 families. Although some would say it's not comparable, pain is pain. And they had to breathe life into the Congress that wanted to slowly and maybe orderly address a question of pain. And so what I would say is that this meeting at the press club, which symbolizes prominence to the lives that have been lost, is a statement that we're not going to rest and we're going to breathe life into the statute, ask for accountability, ask for reporting. It's one of the elements that is not specific in the statute, is regular reports to the United States Congress. And so that needs to be refined. Let me say that the Justice Department under Eric Holder, we all know, has been one of the most vibrant, one of the most focused, and certainly on the current recent time frame, incidences that certainly have been mountainous, from terrorism to tragic police killings and other things, and civil rights issues. And so I would say that there is this framework. We've got to roll up our sleeves and be engaged so much that we have these reports. And so I sit here today saying I am moved, as I will be in the meeting in the afternoon, that we will get the reports as to what more does the Department of Justice need. For example, they may need some greater tools that we're not seeing in the framework of the legislation. But I think the point that I want to add as an enhanced component to the outcry of these families is the local jurisdictions, the local attorney generals, the local district attorneys. Frederica, I believe that partnership and the example of the DA task force or other, there are many, many task forces that are unified between local prosecutors and local law enforcement. We do that all the time in the federal government, and we get things done. And I think there needs to be the language in the bill that creates a task force that includes the local component to it. And then you've got those boots on the ground, and you have the accountability, because local guys, local district attorneys, they've got to get their work done, as they say, a little bit quicker. So that's what I think would be very important.
All right. And Judge Ted McGee, if I could involve you in this conversation too, do you see a disconnect between the localities and the federal level of tackling these cases involving the federal prosecutors and even local investigators?
I'm not really on the ground where if there's a disconnect that I would see it. I do think that, and I think the Congresswoman said it beautifully, that there's a disconnect insofar as the current society is not willing to address this or face it. This country has a history of domestic terrorism and apartheid that has never really faced. I mean, in terms of the language that's used, we call it segregation. We don't call it apartheid. We don't refer to the terrorism that happened here as terrorism, but it clearly was terrorism. This is an example of unbridled terrorism backed up by local law and the force of statutes and custom. I think the disconnect comes more, not institutionally now, I don't know. I think Paula and Janice can answer that, and the family's better than me. But in terms of the culture, there is a disconnect. And one thing I did want to ask both Janice and Paula, in terms of the need for local cooperation or cooperation between the federal government and the local government, and that is whether or not the local governments in these localities are willing to. Is the mindset changed to the point where they would be willing to cooperate with the federal government, or is there still a kind of, we don't want to air our dirty linen, why you opening these shadows now, let well enough alone? It happened a long time ago, because I could see that local mentality interfering with the need to cooperate, even if the Justice Department wanted to.
I wonder, Paula, can you address that? Being on the ground and interacting both on the federal and the locality level, has it been your observation?
We have gotten different responses from local law enforcement, from the district attorneys and the attorneys general that we have visited. One thing, let me just say this about why it's important to have this sort of cooperation. It's a matter of jurisdiction in terms of what kind of law could apply in a given case. And the reason why it becomes so significant for the local folks to be involved is because they may have more at their disposal in terms of legal possibilities. The federal government, federal statutes don't have statutes on murder per se, for instance. But in the states and localities there are. And there is no statute of limitation on murder. So that means that if a case were to be brought, most likely it would have to be brought on that local level, but with federal assistance in order to do that. And so that's why that cooperation, the resources become so important for joint efforts. Now, so we have gone and we have spoken to law enforcement officials in the different states, and mostly in the Delta South, not exclusively. Some of them have greeted us, have been happy to see us come. Some with a little bit more reluctance. We've had one prosecutor say to us, "We knew the day was coming when you would come here," and we said, "Well, that day is here." And there are these cases in your jurisdiction, and we expect for you to handle these cases. Now, others have had quite the opposite response, and they have said, "You know, we have this kind of, arm's length of cases. How do you expect for us to do something from 40 or 50 years ago?" Now, I will add again that within the statute there is funding that is supposed precisely for that purpose, knowing that the local jurisdictions have less fiscal latitude than the federal government would have. And so that could also help them to do these cases. So we insist that on whatever level law enforcement exists, that they take the active role in pursuing the cases and prosecuting the cases. And so irrespective of what their own views are about that, there's a mandate for these cases to be done.
Make
Yes.
one closing comment. Paula squarely framed that structure that is missing. Let me add that in the local jurisdictions, they have greater access to witnesses. And she's absolutely right about the arm of the federal government. In these instances, as in Michael Brown, Eric Garner, the review is the question of the violation of civil rights. That's the context in which they're looking, where the local jurisdiction can squarely look at a question of murder or any other lesser offense, which we would hope not, because someone has been murdered. So I would simply indicate we have a pathway. I just want to say to the families, we have a pathway. There is a provision that can be expanded so that when the center shows up, they now can say, do you know you are required to investigate these cases of which loved ones are still mourning? And I believe that that framework and the possible language of creating task forces will be the element of which may be a point of discussion for all of us. And I hope that people will leave here, Frederica, with the sense of hope that Lincoln said that we as Americans cannot be free until all our citizens are free. And therefore we cannot be free until these cases of these loved ones and others who are not in this room are solved and resolved and at least addressed for the human dignity of everyone. And I, again, thank you. So we have a pathway.
Thank you.
Can I add?
Absolutely.
Is this working?
Well, I can hear you.
Hello?
Can you all in the
Okay.
back hear?
All right.
Yes, Janice? Okay.
I just want to add that while the provision is there, Congresswoman, that hasn't been used by the Justice Department. And we're not quite sure why, except we've gone to district attorneys. They've said, well, if I had the money, I'd do this. I have one investigator for my whole county, or I don't have the resources. And we said, well, the Act has resources.
To the tune of what, $10 million a year?
Well, there's
The
$13 million
availability?
total in the Act, and $2 million a year is set aside for local. I think there could be some shift in that money allocation. But they said, well, how do we apply for it? And so we sort of looked at how that would be done. Very, very difficult, complex process for the way that this has been designed by the Justice Department to apply for the money. And we have personally asked the Justice Department, tell us what the most efficient way is for these local, the state's attorney general in Louisiana has asked for, local district attorneys. And they said, well, don't tell them to apply for it because we don't have the money. So I think we need your help and the rest of Congress to either do oversight or to ask those questions of the Justice Department about, well, why don't you have the money for this? We've indicated this, you haven't asked for it in the appropriations. This is a part of the bill. So we need your help in kind of making that a viable provision.
I think there'll be many members of Congress that will join in that
Yes.
effort.
Okay.
Thank you.
We do have a microphone available that can make its way around the room, so if anyone has questions or comments, and Alvin Sykes, I know you represented the Emmett Till family in getting this act passed, so while I guess while some of you assess the question that you want to ask, and just raise your hand so the microphone, Scott over here has another microphone, and it can make its way to you. Meantime, Mr. Sykes.
Thank you very much. Hello.
I don't know why that keeps going off. Automatically.
I think this one worked.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Got
okay,
it.
great. Thank you very much. It's been a long time since 2002 when me and Mamie Till Mobley had this discussion about what's coming and what has happened by way of investigation of her son's case, as well as what became the Emmett Till Unsolved Civil Rights Crime Act, and the formation of the Emmett Till justice campaign to look at these cases and all other cases. I want to get straight to the point about some parts of this, and I'm glad to hear what the Congresswoman said. One of the things where the problem has come in terms of the prosecution by an investigation by the Justice Department is you got to walk through one of the cases to see. And basically, when you have a case that is brought to the Justice Department that was on the list, they were able to investigate cases that came within their federal jurisdiction. There was a 5-year statute of limitation on those, so they couldn't prosecute them, but they could investigate them. They can investigate to detect whether a crime occurred. And then if they gathered information, then they could work with the state in terms of prosecution. They could cross-deputize the attorneys from the Civil Rights Division to work these cases. But part of the problem was the federal statutes that were included. The statute that was included in the act required that it be racially motivated cases. The problem with that on the front end is if you can't prove the racial motivation, they don't get to the rest of the merits of the case and of the issue. But if they had used the police misconduct statute, the one that doesn't require racial motivation, and if you look at most of the cases that occurred during that period of time,
meaning like jeopardizing or tampering with evidence?
no, where the deputy sheriffs that were the ones that had the hoods on were deputy sheriffs.
Jobs.
Right, they were actually involved in it, so they were under the cloak of their authority as a law enforcement. They would stop people and then lynch them. So if you use that statute and the authority that comes under that, which the majority of these cases do involve, then you would be able to get into investigating the case. They would, and then take the results of that on the state level for potential prosecution. So there are changes that do need to be in the law in terms of the scope and as well as the length of the law. And ultimately, the original vision was that there would ultimately be a permanent code case in the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office, just like you have going across the country now. You have code case units on the state level where cases that become code, they go back and investigate them. Well, a code case can be a case 30 days old if you don't have any more leads on it, so there shouldn't be a time limit on it. And with all the thousands of cases that and complaints that the FBI, the U.S. attorneys, the Civil Rights Division receive, and only a few of those make it through to the court system, if there's a permanent code case unit that can always look at all of these cases as they develop and as they come into now into 2014 and in the future, there needs to be a permanent structure.
Well, perhaps, you know, as Congresswoman was saying, this really is a starting point,
yes,
as opposed to an end point. And she talked about, you know, amendments being part of helping to move it forward, progress. So perhaps those kinds of suggestions will be taken under consideration later as well.
And there needs to be, and we see that there's a need for an Emmett Till Law Review Task Force for supporters to work with together on the changes that need to be made, to work with Congress on it, to work with the Justice Department, because we do need to partner and work with them, and then bring about the amendments, bring about the reauthorization, bring about a permanent structure.
We're going to leave it right there because we do have a couple questions also from the audience, and I want to try and involve as many people as possible. And then Charles Steele with the SCLC, I'd love to get with you as well momentarily. So over here in, again, beautiful red, this holiday red, I love that. Okay, what's your question?
My question is, it goes right back to the beginning of this, and that is that the act authorizes a deputy chief who is responsible for that. Does the Justice Department actually have a person in place who is called the deputy chief of the criminal section of the Civil Rights Division, whose job is to monitor these cases and make a report every year? I mean, there's $10 million a year annually for that. There's $1.5 million annually for a community service project. And I'm just wondering, is there Is there a person?
Okay, I wonder, Paula or Congresswoman, whoever would like to address that?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, or perhaps Mr. Sykes?
I mean,
Well,
they're required by
let me
law.
just say this, Alvin, because we've met with the deputy. Yeah, yes, there is a deputy
Okay,
chief.
boom, one word answer, love that.
Yes. And I will say that, Congresswoman, you know, that in the statute that the department is required to issue a report annually about their progress on the statute. There is remarkable, I guess I would say, similarity from one report to the next, which doesn't show that there has been progress made under the act. And so they have the people in place, at least in those top positions. But again, in terms of the attorneys in the field, where you would need a corps of attorneys located in these jurisdictions to work with the local folks. That has not been done. So you can't have one assistant U.S. attorney, for instance, responsible for the cold cases and also responsible for all of the other federal crimes in that jurisdiction. There need to be people who are dedicated to this work in order to be effective. We visited with the Department of Justice last October, was it October 11, I think, where we presented a list of nearly 300 cases where we had investigated that, we and our students had investigated that, and we considered them suspicious, racially motivated suspicious cases. And we gave that to the Department of Justice, and we have yet to hear whether they are doing anything with that list. And that is well beyond the list of 70 that is attached to the bill itself, which SCLC, which the Southern Poverty Law Center helped to put together. We knew at the time that the bill was passed, but that was not a definitive list. But the department have treated it as though that were a final number. And so as they go through the list, sort of, checking off those that they've either done some investigation on or made some attempts toward, they haven't fully embraced the notion that there are many more victims out there whose cases need to be identified and resolved.
I think one of the things that's missing in the reporting, obviously many reports come to Congress and we appreciate that kind of oversight, but I think as the civil rights leaders like Charles Steele recognize, you have to have details of what counts. And so you need to enunciate in these reports more specific details, which is the comment that I was making about looking at how those reports are written and what more you need to put in, what overlays you need to put in to make sure that you actually get a report of, have you closed the case, and of course that's supposed to be in it, but you should indicate, and that is now a requirement, that you have a certain percentage closed and you will report on the fact that you've closed them in a way that shows that you have maximized the investigation. I just want to put another name in the pool that is not an old case, but many people remember James Barrett, and that case obviously went to the Civil Rights Division. But we have a case in Jasper, Texas, Albert Wright, which I'm sure has come to the attention of many, and that is just to say that these cases continue, and that means this law is very important because 3 decades from now, a case that was in 2014 may be a cold case. So this is a very viable law and a law that's very needed.
So it sounds like some permanency. We're hearing that from you, that it likely stands a very good chance of going past 2017.
I think it would be
and
important.
the amendments that you talked about.
I think it would be
possibly.
important.
Yes.
I do.
Can I have?
Oh, go ahead.
I just had a question since we're talking about Department of Justice and reports. I just found out this week, well, last night, I was under the assumption that when they notify the families after they've done the investigation, and I'm talking about the families where they have done the investigations, and they basically come up with the resolve from just looking at the reports that there's nothing else that can be done. And I thought that they actually brought these families together like they did the Till family, and went through everything with them and explained why, what the new evidence was, if there was any, et cetera. I just found out that they send letters to these families They don't even do that with the other families. So I guess because we're the Till family, we receive that kind of treatment from the Department of Justice. And so that was heartbreaking to me. And I think that just adds more insult to injury. And as I read all of the reports that I was sent to prepare for today, and it kept talking about the closure that the families received. And just continue to talk about the families. This is the way that the families are to receive closure. Yes, it is a sense of closure to some degree, but families, we don't receive closure. The Till family has not received closure for Emmett's death through the reopening of the trial. It helps because we feel like we didn't fail, we didn't just give up. So you do receive that type of closure. But for us, even today in 2014, even if it's really no relevance, every victim today, Emmett Till's name trends. Mike Brown is today's Emmett Till. Eric Garner, I Can't Breathe is today's Emmett Till. Amadou Diallo, today's Emmett Till. Sean Bell, today's Emmett Till. I can name them all. Everyone has been compared to Emmett Till. And the next one will be compared to today's Emmett Till. You see images, Kendrick Johnson next to Emmett Till. So I say that to say the Department of Justice, even in as much of the cases that they have reviewed, that they have closed, I think they need to be a little bit more sensitive to the fact that these were people's children, their brothers, their sisters, their grandfathers, grandmothers, and I think that they need to take that into consideration and offer a little bit more sympathy, compassion when they're dealing with these families, because that broke my heart.
That could be.
Sorry, go ahead. We do have a question in the back. Okay, what's your question?
Kadesh, my question is, in the case of Michael Brown and Eric Gardner and Trayvon Martin, we see this unfortunate excuse of he was a thug type thing. And we see that perpetrated through different people, whether personal opinions or the media. No offense. But, you know, I wonder, in the Emmett Till case and in the case of the two fishermen, what were the excuses that were used back then to sort of shift away the attention from achieving justice?
Oh, I think, Mr. Delaney, you might be really in a great position to help convey that. Not because of your reporting, of course, but you were on the receiving end when trying to dig for information. And the excuses or explanations that you were given encompass what?
Well, it's always, the terms that the gentleman just mentioned. We get that, and you've got to look at the type of media that will take that kind of and run with it, and the media that will not do it. And it's that is going to happen. Regardless, and it's just a matter of as readers and listeners and viewers, we've got to separate the crap from the real thing. But we've got to expect that every time there is this kind of any kind of a situation involving police, etc., that the first thing they'll do is denigrate the victim. That's just a tactic and we have got to, and we try. You know, this gets into another issue that could be the subject of another forum, that is the media itself and how the media has, over the years, handled all of these cases. Well, personally, as a journalist, and again, I started covering the civil rights movement from the modern movement from the beginning. What I really want to get down to is the media have changed. There is a different media today that we're all trying to adapt and adjust to, and I think as consumers of that media, we've got to, and we've got to learn how to discriminate ourselves against what is bad media and what is good media. But we're going to have to contend with it, especially now, as you know, the differences and the problems we're having even determining what is media, who is a journalist, what is reporting, et cetera.
No.
But
Charles-
that's a topic for another forum.
That'll be the next session. Okay, go ahead.
I just want to say something very briefly because I think that is such an important point. Because so often we are asked, for instance, in the case of Darlene's great-grandfather, Frank Morris, why Frank? He was a shoe repair shop owner. What distinguished him in this small community of Faraday, Louisiana, was that in this time when social mores and even laws forbade people from interacting interracially, his shop was one of the few places in that community, in the society, where all people could come through the front door. He was someone who was a mentor to young black men and the entire community. So he was well respected, he was revered in his community. When his death occurred, people started to say, why would they do that to Frank? And we say, why not Frank? Because this man who held himself with such dignity in his community, this black man who was simply living his life, doing what we expect people to do in terms of gainful employment, in terms of being the kind of role model in his community, was singled out simply for that. Many of the people who are on the list were not the quote-unquote activists per se. They were people like a Frank Morris who were simply living in their communities. And for that, they could be targeted. And so then rumors began about who this man was to disparage him and his reputation, as opposed to turning the focus on the people who would take the time and the mendacity to pour a flammable liquid around someone's shop while people were inside and not care what happened to them. So we don't really care so much about whether Frank Morris had any kind of dalliances which people suggest that he may have had. And we frankly don't believe that that was the case. But we do care that because this African-American man worked hard, was someone upstanding in his community, would be killed because of that, that should be the focus of the efforts, and that is why this statute is so important to be implemented in the most effective, in the most thorough way.
And Charles Steele of the SCLC, I'd love to involve you in that, because when we talk about rumors, distractions, that's a technique which is as old as the offenses themselves.
I just want to make a general statement. I've enjoyed all of you. You've done a great job. I'm close to several of the families. As you know, Erica, Miss Mamie Till Mobley was a personal friend of mine. We had many talks. I know the story. I know the details. She would come to my home in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, where I'm from, and just spend 5 or 6 days with my wife and children. And then we would go to California, meet, and just spend a great time together, because we were very close. And my wife was an educator. She's retired now, as well as Miss Mamie Till Mobley. And you know Mr. Mobley loved to cook. He always bragged about cooking. And we would go to Chicago just to confirm the fact that he was a great cooker. But those types of things are close to me, because it's about relationship. Congresswoman, it's always a pleasure seeing you. And I know you always compliment and talk about SCLC. And you told me about your background, and I just love you for it. I'm going to be to the point. You said something, Paul, and he and I got a Tuscaloosa background together in Alabama and Montgomery. Paul said something, you probably didn't pick up on it in your first presentation, right at the end, and I wrote it down. He said, we have to light a fire under the Justice Department. You got what is called your so-called freedom today because Dr. King and others lit a fire. And we have become so complacent. And not only with the Pensacola 10, Tyrone and I talk about this every day. And he talk about Morris Ford Bridge. I was born in 1946. And that was just a few days before I was born, as you mentioned in your report. The Mackers and the Dorseys on that bridge in Georgia. And one of the ladies was expecting. And here you have a mob talking about terrorism. African Americans been through terrorism and still going through it. The Terrorist Act. This is what we've been going through all of our lives. I just got back from Berlin, been in Berlin, bringing home with this 4 times this year. Because it's a history between Berlin and Dr. King. And I was invited over to speak at Dr. King's birthday last year. But Daddy King was there in 1934. And that's when he decided to change the name of Martin, of Martin Luther King as we know him. He was 5 years of age, from Michael to Martin. He changed both of their names from Michael to Martin because of the 16th century theologian, Martin Luther. A lot of people don't know that. So that's why they wanted me over there. Still you in Dr. King's position. What's going on? And I just got back 3 weeks ago. Mikhail Gorbachev came in and joined a covenant with SCLC because he said we would never have freedom in the world without African Americans and SCLC in the civil rights movement. What am I saying? We are very powerful. Stop complaining about the Justice Department. Hell, let's make them do what's right. Let's make them do what's right. You got the power to do it. And Dr. King was about collaboration. He didn't worry about no memberships, raising money and all this. He collaborated with everybody. Now you call the leaders of society today and they won't even return your phone call because we're not collaborating. So we must put the blame where it is. It's on the people. Congresswoman, I respect you. You always talk about the movement. But how many more talk about the movement and that we have to have SCLC in the Civil Rights Organization? Let me close with this. I asked President Mikhail Gorbachev, I was the only American invited to the symposium for the fall of the Berlin Wall. Only. He was sitting at one head of the symposium, I was at the other one. Look, country boy from Tuscaloosa, Alabama. But I got a civil rights background. That's what impressed him. And I used to be ashamed from being from Alabama. But guess what? I discovered as I traveled the world, people bow to me when I say I'm from Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Because we had courage. And I asked President Mikhail Gorbachev, you saved this planet called Earth. How did you do it? You went against the grain of the Soviet Union. How did you do it? He said, first of all, Charles, we live in a global village. You don't just have America no more. You have one community. When Dr. King spoke in Berlin in 1964, he said, no man-built wall can separate God from his children. He said, that touched me. That touched me. 25 years after Dr. King spoke in Berlin, Germany, that's when the walls were dismounted. And it wasn't because of President Reagan at the time who said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear that wall down. Oh, y'all remember that. It was the spirit of the civil rights movement. And I'm saying today we've gotten complacent. We think we have arrived and we're beyond that. But the infrastructure of the civil rights movement is where we must stay because you're always going to need it and where you need to go back to. So I'm offering my support. We don't have no money. People don't give to us no more. You know, they killed Dr. King and they thought they were going to kill SCLC. But I promise you, the good Lord himself has given me the spirit. He's given me the vision. He's given me the courage. And first of all, this is what I learned from going to Berlin with Mikhail Gorbachev. He said, you can't be no leader being afraid. So if you're scared, and if you think that you're fearful of what's going to take place, don't get involved with this issue. we call freedom and justice and equality for all God's children. Thank you so much. I enjoy being here. Love is what love does, and I love you.
Thank you so much. I think we have time for one last question. One last question.
Well done.
Oh, okay, one last question right here.
Hello? Hello? Hi. It's not a question, it's a comment. You were talking about how the families are notified. I covered a case one time, a woman named Evangeline Moore. Her father and mother, Harry T. Moore and Harriet V. Moore, were killed in 1951, Christmas Day. Their house was bombed. Everybody knew the Klan did it. For 3 years, she waited while the Justice Department allegedly investigated. She got a 2-line letter in the mail saying that the case has been closed, there's no additional information to be found. She wept like a baby when she spoke. I understand that they're busy, Congresswoman, but that ought to be one thing that whoever is in charge, of the oversight. The other thing is, after she got that letter, I called the investigator in Florida who was in charge of investigating that case, and I asked him what he did. We talked for about 10 minutes, and I came out of it knowing that he did absolutely nothing. He waited for 3 years and sent a letter to an 81-year-old woman who'd been waiting since 1951 to get justice for her family. She takes 8 antidepressants a day to this day because she cannot get over the fact that as a young woman living in Washington, D.C., her parents' house was firebombed on Christmas Day, and nobody has been able to give her justice for that.
Right. Thank you so much to everyone. I know we're out of time. We've got another event coming up. First of all, I think the fire's lit. Fire's still burning. And these are indeed the keepers of that flame until there is some universal resolution that I think everyone is going to be happy with. Thanks to Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, Paula Johnson, Paul Delaney, Darlene Nichelle Morris Newell, Erica Gordon, Ollie Gordon, Thelma Wright Edwards, Charles Steele, Alvin Sykes, Judge McKee, and thanks to all of you for your questions and keeping the conversation going. The dialogue does continue. It doesn't end here when you leave. Drive safely outside, and thanks so much for being here this evening. Or it is morning still, right? Okay, this morning, one long day. Thank you.